Hi guys, Leo from King of the Mountain here. Today I'm going to be showing you how to change your disc and or ratchet on a KOM Xeno REAR hub. This video is for the standard fitting of ratchets. For low clearance versions you'll need slightly different tooling and steps to remove the disc and ratchet assembly. You will need a T25 wrench, 4 M5 nuts, preferably not nylock as it makes them a bit easier to spin onto the bolts, a spanner or ring spanner to hold the nuts. This one's an 8mm, a calibrated accurate torque wrench that can go to 6 Newton meters, a T25 bit to fit the torque wrench, some light grease. We have Motor X, Shimano will also do, just make sure it isn't a heavy grease. Some medium strength thread locker. We have blue Loctite 243, that's some good stuff. Either some standard M5 bolts or the ones that came with your hub, a pick or blade to remove the O-rings, and then some stuff you might need depending on one of the steps: a plastic or rubber mallet, a vise with soft jaws in, and finally a rag or some paper towel. First, remove the wheel from the bike and then remove the insert and place it to one side. Using your T25, remove the 4 bolts holding on the cap and disc and ratchet assembly. Now you've removed all 4 bolts, take the disc, pull straight up and off. The pawls and springs should stay in, but still be wary of them. And there you have your cap, disc and ratchet assembly. Put the wheel to one side. We'll do some cleaning and greasing of the pawls and paw holder later. Push the cap straight off the ratchet. You should be able to just do it with your thumbs. And now take this O-ring and remove it just to avoid damaging it. If you are replacing your ratchet and you don't have a spare O-ring, then remove the O-ring from the back of the ratchet and save it for later. Unless you've been sent a disc and ratchet assembly and you're planning to replace both, you'll need to remove the ratchet from the disc. The ratchet is a tight fit in the disc and tightness can vary depending on temperature, dirt ingress and the time it's been on the bike. First, try to push the ratchet out of the disc with your thumbs. If you've managed to push the ratchet out by hand, skip to this part in the video. If you cannot push out the ratchet with your hands, then go to your vise with soft jaws. Make sure to support the disc as close to the ratchet as possible without scratching it to avoid bending the disc. Use a rag to avoid scratching the ratchet. Take your plastic mallet, don't use a metal one as you'll damage the lip for the O-ring, and tap the ratchet out, going around the ratchet, tapping on the highest point, aiming to keep the ratchet as straight in the disc as possible. Now that you have your ratchet removed from your disc, you should thoroughly clean whichever part you're reusing. In my case, I'm replacing the disc so I can get rid of my old disc and clean up the ratchet, especially the faces which will touch the disc. If you were reusing the disc, you'd clean up here. Now we're going to push the ratchet into the disc. You have to make sure the ratchet is pushed in the right side of the disc so as to get the rotation of the disc correct. This is the rotation of the disc, but it's also written on the disc. This plain shank is what presses into the disc and needs to be pressed in from behind the disc, the side with no writing on, poking through to the front of the disc with the writing on. It's very important to get the holes of the ratchet perfectly lined up with the holes of the disc, otherwise you won't be able to fit the bolts through. To do this, make sure the bolts are clean, then put them through the disc and the ratchet using the plain shank of the bolts to align the disc and ratchet. Once aligned, push the ratchet into the disc very slightly to keep it in position. Depending on temperature and how clean your surfaces are, you may be able to just push the ratchet in by hand, like so. If you can, then you can skip to this part in the video. If not, then we'll need to use the bolts and the nuts to pull the ratchet into the disc. After aligning the ratchet in the disc and pressing it in as far as you can, take the ratchet cap, place it on the disc and put your bolts through the ratchet cap, the disc and the ratchet. Then take your nuts and spin them onto the bolts. Once you've spun the nuts on as far as they'll go with your fingers, take your spanner and your T25 and do up each nut a small amount at a time. You're aiming to keep the gap as even as possible, pushing the ratchet in nice and square. Keep tightening the nuts and pushing in the ratchet until the nuts have tightened and stopped against the plain shank of the bolts. The ratchet won't yet have pulled fully home, but when attaching the ratchet and disc assembly back onto the hub, it will pull flush against the disc. Undo the nuts and take the bolts and ratchet cap off. Now that you've removed your ratchet cap, bolts and nuts, take one of the O-rings that you removed earlier and fit it to the groove in the back of the ratchet. Stretching it slightly will help it sit fully in the groove and also make sure to put some grease on it. Take the other O-ring and fit it to the ridge on the ratchet. This will seal against the cap, but first put some grease on it to help stick it on the ratchet while you're assembling it. Now that you've fully or partially pushed your ratchet into your disc, you can get a hold of your hub. Now's a good time to clean up your paws and paw holder. If they're already clean on your hub, then you can skip ahead to this time of the video. To clean up your paws and paw holder, you'll need to remove your paws and paw springs. When removing the paws, rotate the stub axles out of the stub axle holes, being very careful not to damage or lose the paw springs in the process. Clean all faces of your paws, including the teeth and the faces that will contact the hub. Clean the springs very carefully if you have to, as you don't want to damage them. If you do damage them, make sure to buy some fresh ones to keep your hub working at its best. When cleaning the paw holder, make sure to thoroughly clean all the faces where the paws contact it. Also thoroughly clean the disc brake lug so that the ratchet can pull against the hub properly. Now that you've cleaned your paws, paw springs and paw holder, before reassembling you'll want to grease some areas. The main places to get are the faces where the paws rotate in the paw holder, and also the holes where the springs sit so that they stick when you fit them in. Now you can go ahead and put your paw springs back into your paw holder. I like to put them all in at once now that you've got the grease there to help them stick. After that, rotate your paws back into their stub axle slots, again being careful not to damage your springs in the process. Give each paw a little test to check that they all push back and return as they should. With your freewheel assembly back together, it's now time to refit your ratchet. Put a healthy amount of grease on the ratchet teeth, but don't be tempted to pack your freewheel assembly and or ratchet full of grease, as this can affect performance a lot if the paws aren't allowed to move how they should. Take your ratchet and disc assembly and rotate it onto your paws in the freewheeling direction. You may need to hold the cassette on the other side so that the paw holder doesn't just spin. You may also need to hold a couple of paws in with your fingers while rotating the ratchet on. Now check that the ratchet is fully pressed against the hub so that you know your O-ring behind the ratchet hasn't been dislodged. Take your cap and put it on the top of the ratchet nice and square, being careful not to dislodge your O-ring from this ridge. The cap should press fully home against the disc if your O-ring is in the correct position. Line up your ratchet and cap holes with the lugs on your hub shell. Take your hub bolts, put medium strength thread lock on each bolt thread and spin them into the hub until you feel any resistance. You must use thread locker on the bolts. Don't tighten with your T25 wrench, we'll do that with the torque wrench. Take your calibrated torque wrench and T25 bit, set the torque wrench to 6 Newton meters. If you press the disc into the ratchet earlier with your hub bolts, then the ratchet won't be pressed fully into the disc yet, so you should expect some movement when tightening up. Using your torque wrench, tighten each bolt a small amount at a time until they are all at 6 Newton meters. Your ratchet should now be pressed fully home in the disc. Now take your insert, grease your O-ring in the insert and put some grease on these faces on the hub and the insert. The tightness of your O-ring seals is dependent on how much grease you have in the groove that they sit in. If you want your O-ring to seal tighter against the hub, then remove the O-ring and put a little more grease underneath and refit. They should self-adjust and self-center once back in the hub. You can then refit your insert. Now check that your hub freewheels properly without tight spots to make sure neither of your O-rings are caught in the freewheel mechanism. If it doesn't freewheel properly, then take your ratchet back off to reseat your O-rings and reattach. It's likely you got some grease on your disc while doing this, so before putting the wheel back on the bike, make sure to give the disc a good clean with some brake cleaner. Now all that's left to do is refit the wheel to your bike and go out and hit the trails.